My name is Matan Sandler. I'm a PhD student at the Israeli Institute for Israeli Studies, and I'm also a co-member of This Is Not an Ulpan. We teach Hebrew and Arabic. I want to welcome you to this breakout session about progressive anti-Semitism, the best practices from the world. I will be the moderator. So during this session, each speaker will have 6 minutes, which is a very ambitious timeline, but I will do my best so we will keep it. So they will have 6 minutes to present their experiences with progressive anti-Semitism and what best practices can be adopted to help deal with this phenomena of Israel and Jewish erasure in progressive discourse. And after that, if time permits, we'll have a short Q&A. Now, these sessions, they're all recorded and they will be posted on reutgroup.org, which is the website of the Reut Institute. So you'll be able to access all the discussions. And I encourage you to write comments and write your questions in the chat box. The input will be gathered by the Reut group and it will be kept and saved. So even if we won't have time for all the questions or all the comments, we really encourage you to leave them. So let me introduce our speakers and then we'll begin. So first we'll have David Hirsh. David Hirsh is a senior lecturer in sociology at the Goldsmiths University of London and the director of the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. We also have Sara Saber Freedman with us. She's the executive vice president of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, Canada's national Jewish advocacy organization. She has an extensive experiences in the areas of community advocacy and public policy and administration. Next, we have Rotem Oreg. Rotem is a researcher, activist, and the founder of the Israeli Democratic Alliance, an Israeli nonprofit working to bring together Israelis and Americans based on liberal values and organizations. Then we have Simone Rodan Benzaquen. Simone Rodan Benzaquen. She's the managing director of the AJC Europe. She's overseeing AJC's offices in Berlin, Brussels, Paris, Prague, and many other cities in Europe. Prior to coming to the AJC, she served as an advisor in the and then ambassador for human rights in the French Ministry for Foreign, Europe, and European Affairs. And last, we'll have David Hatchwell. He was the president of the Jewish community of Madrid from 2011 to 2017. And he co-founded the current chairs on the Fundación Hispanic Judía. I'm sorry, I'm probably pronouncing it very wrong. That is dedicated to building bridges between the Spanish-speaking and the Jewish worlds. He's also a co-founder of ACOM, which is a leading pro-Israel public diplomacy platform. So we will now start the discussion. I again remind all our speakers that we have 6 minutes. I will try and keep the times. It's very ambitious, so let's all stick by it. So we will start with you, David. Please.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. Opposition to racism and to other structures of unjust discrimination are held to be completely hegemonic in academic life and in left-wing and radical politics. Opposition to anti-Semitism is assumed to be included in this culture, but our experience, our scholarship, and our research tell us that it is not. Populist and far-right anti-Semitism are recognized, although even here, they are not well understood. The significance of left and liberal anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are radically downplayed across scholarly and political life. Anti-Semitic ideas, assumptions, and premises are frequently embraced, and they are widely tolerated and seen as legitimate even by people who do not embrace them. And this proposition, along with the anti-Semitism inherent in much academic and political thinking, is generally and angrily denied. In practice, anti-Semitism is often thought of, presented, and taught as liberational and anti-racist, while Jews are often portrayed as being central to and symbolic of oppression and injustice. Opponents of anti-Semitism are frequently devalued as unsophisticated and conservative, or as propagandists for Israel. Israel is often conceived of as a unique or symbolic evil in the world. The academic study of contemporary anti-Semitism is not well supported by universities, mainstream disciplinary journals, publishers, or funding bodies, and it is not valued within existing academic disciplines. Even Jewish studies and Israel studies, even Holocaust studies and genocide studies as disciplines are in crisis. The material and moral pressures to accommodate to the culture in academia and in left politics relating to anti-Semitism and to Israel have been strong. As Hannah Arendt observed, assimilation in a time of anti-Semitism means assimilating to anti-Semitism. That is why the need to be better organized is so acute. We are building the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and the perceived need to assimilate to a hostile environment, but a hostile environment which people insist does not exist, is why what we do appears so controversial. What we do is threatening to people who are assimilating to a hostile environment. But the anti-Semitic culture is less strong outside of academia and outside of the cultures of left politics than inside it, perhaps. What may appear heretical or what may just feel dated and conservative inside certain social spaces may appear rather commonsensical outside of it. Anti-Semitism is a universal concern. It is never really about Jews. Its threat is never limited to Jews. Anti-Semitism is attractive to anti-democratic politics and thinking. Openness to anti-Semitic ways of thinking and tolerance of them are related to a broader emerging carelessness about democratic cultures and the democratic state. Many social spaces are increasingly embracing as standard assumptions radical critiques of existing society and of the Enlightenment liberal tradition that underpins our core values. Critique is fine, but frequently this is more accurately described as contempt than critique. Robert Fine wrote of the necessity to hold the critique of existing conditions in one hand, but also to hold the critique of that critique in the other. Following Hannah Arendt, he argued that the experience of 20th century totalitarianism taught us something important about the menacing potential of contempt for everything that exists, especially when it is combined with a utopianism that requires the new world to be built from scratch. It is not accidental that anti-Semitism was associated with both National Socialist and Stalinist totalitarianisms. Anti-Semitism has the potential to function as an emotionally satisfying way of exemplifying the enemy of the people. Conspiracy fantasy, the temptation to account trivially for the injustices that we feel unable to face rationally.
David, I'll just remind you we have 30 seconds. I'm very sorry.
Yeah, I'm aware. You just took 10 of them by reminding me. And to blame somebody and to aspire to conspiratorial power oneself is on the rise in the 20th century. The fragments of older anti-Semitisms remain virulent in the cultural unconscious available to those who decide to pick them up and to mold them into contemporary ideologies or worldviews. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm sorry again for interfering. I just had to make sure. Sara, please.
With pleasure, and I have a timer set, so you don't have to remind me.
Thank
I
you.
want to begin by saying to any journalists who may be listening that nothing I am about to say is for attribution. If you want to speak to me, please reach out to me offline. I'm going to begin by talking a bit about Canada and the Canadian political and social context. I'm then going to introduce a case study relating to anti-Semitism at the Toronto District School Board, known as the TDSB, which is the largest school board in Canada. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the lessons we've learned from our experience working with the TDSB on these issues. First, the context. Contrary to what I thought growing up in the United States, Canada is not just the large landmass that cold fronts come from on your evening news weather map. Canadian political culture particularly is significantly different. We are a self-defined nation of moderates, although where the so-called moderate center sits is somewhat mobile. The Greater Toronto Area is Canada's largest metropolis and is home for about half of Canada's 400,000 Jews. About 60% of Jewish kids in Toronto attend public school, with a balance in Jewish day schools and private schools. The TDSB has 250,000 students, 5,000 of whom are Jewish, and has experienced multiple anti-Semitic incidents over the last years, something like 1 per week. That's the context. Here's the incident. In the spring of 2001, in the midst of the hot conflict between Israel and Hamas, and with the assault, both electronic and physical, on diaspora Jews, a staff person in the TDSB's equity department distributed a training guide to TDSB teachers. The guide used the framework of anti-oppression and anti-colonialist training and was titled Understanding Anti-Semitism at its Nexus with Israel and Zionism. It was offered as a resource for talking to students about the then active shooting war between Hamas and Israel. The guide centered Palestinian voices, linked to a number of highly problematic websites, including that of the PFLP, which is recognized by Canada as a terrorist entity. It arguably justified the use of violence against Israeli Jews and provided an anti-Zionist definition of anti-Semitism that would be unequivocally rejected by the overwhelming majority of Jews. The guide was thus characterized by many people as anti-Semitic and derisive of Jewish and Israeli identity. Given the history of anti-Semitic incidents at the TDSB, there was a strong concern that the guide would enable real-world violence against Jewish students and staff within the TDSB. And the Toronto Jewish community was beyond outraged. The TDSB is overseen by a board of elected trustees. A Jewish trustee, Alexandra Lolka, shared a link on social media to a newspaper article that characterized the guide as anti-Semitic. And here is where we went through the looking glass. The guide's author was briefly suspended and then reinstated. A complaint of Islamophobia against the Jewish trustee was filed with the TDSB Integrity Commissioner. An independent investigator hired by the TDSB exonerated the trustee on the charges of Islamophobia, agreed that elements in the guide were in fact anti-Semitic and supportive of violence against Israeli Jews, but despite these findings, the investigator still recommended that the Jewish trustee be formally censured for failing to recognize in her tweet that only some materials in the guide were anti-Semitic. Now, since this is an open forum, I will not discuss what happened behind the scenes during the investigation and following the investigator's report. I will tell you that every Jewish organization in Canada, including my own, was very vocally outraged. More importantly, perhaps, voices on the non-Jewish moderate left were open in expressing the absurdity of the independent investigator's report. Finally, I will tell you that it became known that the independent investigator had a history of social media comments that suggested a significant anti-Israel bias. Finally, by a vote of 10-7, the board rejected the investigator's recommendations for censure and cleared the commissioner of having breached the TDSB code of conduct. So, what have we learned? First, we confirmed that in certain circles there is a near complete inversion. In those circles, to condemn calls for violence against Jews or Jewish Israelis is Islamophobic or displays anti-Israeli, anti-Palestinian racism. Because the language of race and racism is exclusively understood within the framework of power dynamics, and because Israel and Jews are seen as powerful, these circles hold that Jews cannot be the target of discrimination or hate, and therefore have no right to define what constitutes offensive speech to us. Second, We learned that working from the inside remains the best way to bring change in these kinds of issues. CIJA has seconded our lead subject matter expert on anti-Semitism in progressive environments to the TDSB as a temporary staff person. Her mandate is to develop a TDSB branded curriculum on anti-Semitism for use within the TDSB system. And as part of the arrangement, we asked the TDSB to make the curriculum available to other school boards on request. Finally, we learned that the large moderate center of Canadian culture still holds, although as evidenced by the closeness of the vote, not without challenge. We have to channel the justified anger of our constituents in language that is meaningful to both them and our targets without burning our credibility with either audience. While this is not a new challenge, the 24-hour news cycle and the proliferation of representative voices through social media amplify the difficulty of this task. This is a necessary, absolutely necessary balancing act, and one that all Jewish organizations will need to master if we're going to succeed in pushing back against this pernicious expression of anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your words and also for being very precise. Sorry. Rotem, you are next, please. Floor is yours.
Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, everyone, whenever and wherever you are. My name is Rotem Oreg, and I'm the founder and CEO of the IDA, the Israel Democratic Alliance. Now, before I begin, I wanted to say that on behalf of the IDA, and I believe everyone in this call, our thoughts and prayers are with our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, Jews and non-Jews alike, that we all pray for their safety. 2 years ago, I was in Washington, DC, and a Jewish congressional aide of a Democratic member of Congress, representing one of America's most progressive cities, told me, quote, "In so many aspects, Israel is a progressive power, on climate, on health, on gender equality, on gay rights. We have so much to learn from you that I don't understand my progressive friends." Unfortunately, it appears that in the past 2 decades or so, the public discourse is increasingly unaware of the progressive aspects in Israel's character and in its actions, mostly due to hyper-focus on issues such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My friends, I'm here because Israel and the Democratic Party in America are drifting apart. I don't think it is necessary to explain why drifting apart from the party that represents the majority of Americans, the majority of young Americans, and of course, the majority of Jewish Americans, presents an acute and pressing challenge to Israel. There are many reasons for that drift, from personal divisive political leaders, to policy disagreements, to long-term trends that has to do with strategic, demographic, ideological, and technological changes far beyond the control of any government on either side of the ocean. That being said, I'm an optimist. Therefore, I don't want to talk about challenges. I want to talk about opportunities. Those opportunities are reflected in shared values, the same values reflected in the words of the Jewish congressional aide I was talking with 2 years ago. Poll after poll, including polls conducted by us in the IDA, show that the majority of Israelis support separating state and religion and equal rights for the LGBTQ+ community. They show that the majority of Israelis believe that not enough is done on crucial life and death issues like climate action and mental health. And yes, poll after poll after poll shows the majority of Israelis believe that a two-state solution is the most reasonable way to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this is what we do in the Israeli Democratic Alliance. We build bridges based on mutual liberal values. We bring in together progressives. Tomorrow, we will lead a first of its kind inter-parliamentary dialogue between liberal NGO representatives, party and grassroots leaders, members of Knesset and state legislatures to exchange ideas and best practices on how to tackle climate change. Around International Women's Day, we'll lead a gender equality dialogue between feminist activists from Israel and the United States to address challenges on gender equality in the labor market in times of COVID-19. In between, the IDA is speaking with dozens of Israeli public servants, students, and activists to raise awareness of this challenge and to provide tools to address it. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe in alliances. This is why I'm here. I believe that people with shared values can and should work together. This is what we do. We bring progressives from Israel and from the United States to work together to make both our societies and both our countries better, freer, and more just. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A part.
Hey, thank you very much, Rotem. Simone, we would love to hear from you next. The floor is yours.
Sure. One cannot advocate for racial equality, LGBTQ, and women's rights, condemn corrupt and abusive behavior and other injustices, yet choose to ignore the Palestinian oppression. It doesn't add up. Now, if this message sounds familiar, maybe it's because you've read it before. It's one that was posted on Instagram by supermodel Gigi Hadad and was liked more than 4 million times. That was last May. And the conflict, as the conflict between Hamas and other terrorist organizations in Israel was unfolding. Now, as a European living in France, this kind of talk sounded very much familiar, not only because I was used to these kinds of description, which prevents, I think, anyone from grasping the complexity of a century-old conflict and the fact that there is not one victim, but two, one of them Israeli civilians who had been indiscriminately targeted by a terrorist organization, but because these statements describe a mindset that I have come to know far too well. For decades, we've seen in Europe the emergence of an ideology that used the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a vehicle to atone for its identity crisis with terrible consequences, I think, for Jews. Indeed, since the early 2000s, Europeans were used to seeing newspapers, academics, and politicians addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of the oppressor and the oppressed, the colonizer and the colonized, the racist and the victim. This time, though, the worldview has been also relayed as a glamorous fashion by personalities and influencers such as Gigi Hadad on social media. Now, in this simplistic, moralistic, binary worldview that had provided Europe with what seems to have been the perfect manner for collective group therapy. In the blink of an eye, Europe, the former cradle of Holocaust and colonial powers such as France, has been able to repair the past by finally standing with the victims and the colonized. As Vladimir Yankelevich wrote years ago, anti-Zionism has become the miraculous find, the providential windfall, authorizing heterogeneous groups to hate the Jews with a clear conscience. This new worldview became visible during the Durban conference in September 2001, which instead of fulfilling its primary goal as an anti-racist gathering, ended up vilifying Israel, qualifying it as a racist apartheid state. You have seen the same thing recently in a report by Amnesty International as well. Jews are not hated in the name of their race anymore, but in the name of anti-racism. Now, in Europe, we've seen this phenomenon appear in particular on the left, of course, for the past 2 decades. It was the left who have taken on strong binary anti-Zionist positions, all while pointing to Islamists and young European Muslims who projected their identity crisis linked to colonialism, lack of integration, their difficulty, socioeconomic situation, and sometimes their deep-rooted anti-Semitism onto the Palestinian cause. Now, it's therefore not surprising that in our recent AJC Paris survey, we found that the far left in France holds prejudices against Jews in much higher proportions than the rest of French society. For instance, when it comes to the idea that Jews have too much power in finance or the economic fields, the supporters of the far left candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon are 33% to agree with this view. Now, Jews have very much identified the problem very well. When asked what are the perceived causes of anti-Semitism, the ideas of the extreme left come as the main source, according to more than 20% of the French Jewish population. Now, the question is, what can be done? And that is your question here. What is or could have been effective? I think one of the difficulties that we face is that the difficulties that we face has been to help civil society recognize left-wing anti-Semitism collectively. Everyone knows how to identify a neo-Nazi or a Holocaust denier, but when it comes to the left, who not only perceives itself as being righteous, anti-imperialist, and anti-racist, it's also perceived as such by most of society. And so it becomes much harder. And this once again clearly transpired in our recent AJC surveys in Paris, when asked where anti-Semitism comes from, most French people will name the far left, the far right, Islamists, even conspiracy theorists, but only a very tiny minority perceive the threat as coming from the far left. So a lot still needs to be done. To me, the most important thing is to be pedagogical. This is a battle of ideas. It's important to expose the radical connections that exist between the far left with anti-democratic movements and radicals, with Islamists in Europe, with Hezbollah and Hamas in the Middle East, but also in South America, of course. The leftist ideology needs to be exposed in its wider form. The anti-Western, anti-American, pro-Islamist ideas that they carry that aim to deconstruct the current world order. By the way, something that is visible right now in the war with Putin's Russia, where so many, of course not all, but so many on the far left, out of anti-Americanism, anti-NATO feeling have rushed to criticize support for Ukraine and have been supporting Putin. But it also needs to be explained where this form of anti-Semitism comes from, how it manifests itself, and why it is actually constituting anti-Semitism. So I think the London Center of Contemporary Anti-Semitism that David Hirsh is building couldn't be more important. Now, one of the way AJC Paris did this was by rather an unprecedented online campaign targeting young people called Mot pour Mot, Words Against Ill, in which we targeted young people in particular online with online campaigns that expose the anti-Semitism coming from the far left, deciphered concepts such as anti-Zionism in an effort to expose the true anti-Semitic nature and to force not only public opinion, but also decision makers to denounce it altogether. The idea was not only to push governments to be outspoken about anti-Zionism being anti-Semitism, which has actually led to— I
apologize, I'll just remind you that we're coming to a close. Sorry.
So let me say just two more very, very short things. It is very important also to have public opinion leader, and that is what we are doing as an advocacy organization, to have public opinion leaders expose this new form of anti-Semitism. So when Prime Minister Manuel Valls or President Macron say anti-Zionism is a new form of anti-Semitism, this generates a debate that is so important. And lastly, I would say one of the most important challenges for us as an advocacy organization is to confront the moderate left and the progressive left and ask them to expose the anti-Semitism that comes within their own forum. That is really one of the most important ways to expose that form of anti-Semitism and really create a public debate about it, because once again, many in public opinion simply cannot identify this anti-Semitism. And so the public debate around it is so important. I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone. I'll just remind all our viewers that you can still post questions or comments, even if you won't have time to address them. They will be documented. We will appreciate them. We will appreciate having them. David Hatchwell, please, the floor is yours. David, you are on mute. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Now?
Yes, thank you.
So thank you very much. And thank you to Reut for organizing this. And I want to also thank Simone for actually mentioning former Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls, who's now living in Spain. So that will give me also a cue in terms of what I'm going to speak about. I'll speak from the perspective of somebody who doesn't come from academia. I come from the business world. I'm a businessman, and I'm an activist for the Jewish cause. And I basically have dedicated my life to protecting and supporting Israel, the cause of Israel, and many different causes of freedom that are connected to the cause of Israel. I will tell you that I've heard things over the last hour that I don't agree with, and I didn't like how my friend Jonathan Greenblatt tiptoed into the issue of progressive anti-Semitism being just like climate change. I think climate change is a serious problem, but definitely we should not talk about it as if it's just a long-term issue. I think that when you look at what has happened in democracies definitely in the Spanish-speaking world, and that's where I'm based here in Spain, and I travel very often to places like Mexico, Argentina. And when you look at what is happening in Chile and obviously in Cuba and Venezuela, you will understand that there is a very serious tide going towards the radicalization of the left. And this left is becoming Marxist, active, and dangerous. And what I will tell you is that if we cannot, at the level of organizations that spend a lot of time and money in terms of giving the diagnosis on the situation, if we cannot come up with the reality that we're facing a challenge that is well-structured, organized, and financed, then we have a problem. I think this is why I was saying that it's not just an issue of saying, well, the far-right anti-Semitism in America is worse. I don't know what is worse right now. But if we just talk about this crazy deviation today of where progressives are going, and we don't give it enough attention, then obviously we're not doing our job right. That's why I'm grateful to Reut for organizing specifically this get-together. I believe that the battle for narrative is being lost not only in America, but obviously in other parts of the Western world. We are perceived as a tribe, as a people that is militaristic and that is not attuned with the world today. And this is making us obviously be perceived in many wrong ways, and that are very important to be addressed, because the world is much more connected today than ever. And we can only see it with the fact that everyone has an opinion today about what is happening in the Ukraine. People have become anti-Russian, immediately without knowing the history of the Ukraine-Russia. I'm not saying that I'm pro-Russian, by no means, but I think that people give opinions on this issue, as in many other issues, without having all facts. Now, what is clear is that there are certain things in the 21st century that are not acceptable. Invading another country just to grab land or to support a political position is absolutely not acceptable anymore. But there's always nuances in the things that we need to analyze. So first of all, as I said, I think that we're not understanding very, very well what we have in front of us, what we have against us. I think that once we stop and understand that there are actually countries and organizations that spend an awful amount of money and time in order to destabilize others, then we will understand the realpolitik of today. When we understand that Germany has been dedicating their last 40 years to having no energy security and to depend of the Russian gas, and this has been done because the Green Party in Germany was needed in many coalitions, and it was an actor in the ecosystem of Germany. And nobody criticizes the Green Party today because it's obvious that we're all environmentalists in some degrees. But the question is that the Green Party in Germany was financed by the Soviet Union first and later by Russia. So what I'm saying, and I want it to be very, very clear, because that's what we've been facing in Spain and in other places in the Spanish-speaking world, is that we're fighting against a coordinated effort that is very well financed. There's something called the Forum of Sao Paulo, that is participated by countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, lately Argentina, and Mexico. And this is a problem because ultimately it's very difficult to fight against something that you're not aware of. This is reaching the United States. And the only way that we can fight this is first by understanding it, secondly, by the Jewish communities being active against it. We have won in Spain at ACOM 85 cases against the BDS movement. This doesn't happen just like that. It takes a lot of money and effort, and it's part of a very strong coordinated effort by a group of activists of identifying where the problem comes from. And in our case, it came from a radicalized leftist organization called Podemos, that today, by the way, is in the Spanish government in a coalition with the Socialist government, with the Socialist Party. So again, just to conclude, what I'd like to say is that first we need to identify where the money comes from, where the plan comes from. There is definitely a concerted effort. And this is why, slowly but surely, people are getting a discourse of hatred against Israel, which is very, very well organized. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. Also very precise. First, before we get to the questions and the comments, I really want to thank all our speakers. I'm sorry, I was very strict with the time, but